the cut from semifinals to finals in bouldering is 20-6. It's a really, really gnarly cut. The reality is you have to be exceptional at something, because if you're really good at this one thing, but this person's better than you in that thing that you're really good at, that person will probably take that spot in finals, right? So I think a lot of these people that I try to study and learn from tend to be the best at that thing, and that's a big reason why they're in finals consistently. Standing out essentially is important, because you do have these four boulders or five boulders or whatever it is, and it may just come down to, did you do that one boulder quicker than somebody else? They could be really good at that, but you're just better.
Alvaro Rangel. Al, welcome back to the Testpiece podcast. I'm laughing. I last time we did a podcast, I tried to, or no, I didn't pronounce your last name and let you do it. And I just made a fool of myself trying to do it now. But yeah, actually, no. How did I do, Al? Was that okay?
That was great. But I think no matter what, it's like a very hard. It's got like the R's. It's got all the R's that people have a hard time with from like the Spanish language, because it's like got the Alvaro, the like the that well followed by the Rangel. It's like the two. Those sounds are very difficult. So it's a little bit of
It
a
would have helped
challenging one for sure.
if I didn't start laughing right as I was doing it. Uh, Al, welcome back, man. It's
Thank you.
been over 2 years since we last recorded a podcast, and that was podcast number 7. So a lot has happened. Lots has changed. You are still the head coach and founder of Class 5 in San Diego, although it was a little bit new when you had first started. So I'm psyched to hear more about that. But I have been, well, I knew you before the podcast, the first podcast, but whenever I do a podcast with someone and I get to do that deep dive, I always just kind of pay attention to your Instagram, to whatever social media, kind of keep an eye on you and all the successes you've been having. And last time I clicked on the TV, I saw you on the big screen at the Paris Olympics. I was like, oh, that's Al at the Paris Olympics as assistant coach to the U.S. team. And that made me go, I got to see what Al's up to, because he's crushing it. So first of all, I want to say congrats, man. That is just a heck of an achievement. That was a heck of a show you all put on. And I'm sure no matter what great things you're going to do in the next 2 years in your career, that was probably a pretty cool one. So congrats, Al, and good to have you back, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's pretty much a dream come true. So I think it's like uh, yeah, I'm not great at putting myself out there usually. And like, so you just saying, like, I was watching the Instagram, so you probably won't see much. I think it's pretty funny because a lot of people were actually like, we train out of a pretty small facility, and I see there's not like a crazy amount of people in the gym very frequently, but then I think a lot of people when I came back were like, wait, you were just there. How come we didn't know anything about this? And it's like, yeah, it was cool.
Well, I got to point out San Diego, California, beautiful,
Hmm.
amazing, wonderful place to be. Maybe not typically thought of as the mecca for climbing training. And you are not in the biggest facility. You probably don't have the biggest budgets, but you are one of the best coaches doing it, man. And so cool that you got tapped and pulled out of there. And that is classic Al, low profile. No one knows. But that's why I'm so psyched to get to have you on here, because every time we talk, I learn something, and hopefully we can share that with the world. So yeah, let's dive into it, man. You had just started Class 5 maybe 6 months before, and it's your own facility. And what's been going on in the last couple of years?
Well, for me personally, I think it's like kind of interesting to talk about what it is, because I think even back there when we talked about it, it was like I think I said something, we're on a train to somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, and I think that still holds true. It's definitely like me personally, I've been traveling a lot just with the U.S. team from time to time, so um, that's been taking up a lot of my time. Um, and then with Class 5, it's like a youth program, sort of, but really it's, I would say the thing that kind of congeals it all into something is like a philosophy around climbing. Um, and so a lot of times I'm working with a lot of the people that I'm coaching are coaches of other programs or they're setters in San Diego. And the idea is almost like yeah, just like a unifying idea around climbing, and we're all kind of communicating it in a similar way so that we are trying to take it in a different direction. Um, and that was born out of a long time ago. I guess like it was a frustration around kind of the language that we were using to describe climbers. I remember just watching competitions. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. Um, and the word strong, like the word strong was predominantly like the word that's being used to describe, a climber and how they were doing. And it still is, but I think it's changing quite a bit. Um, and so that kind of set off class five into basically just like the goal is to shape the culture in San Diego in a way that's like going to be conducive to, I think, good competitive climbers, good outdoor climbers, just good climbing in general.
Geez, Al, you jumped right into it by saying this different philosophy of climbing that is a thread that ties us all together. And so I gotta ask you, what is that philosophy? I'm sure you don't have it all quite hammered out for one pithy sentence, but let's pick on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, going back to strong, I think the main reason I like tied into just this word specifically, it's funny, I did it, there was a national cup at Mesa Rim, this was a while ago, and I was asked to do the commentary, and it was pretty bad. Like, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was asked to do the commentary, and I did it with this other person, and basically I told them, like, hey, my goal for this whole thing is to not use the word strong at all during this entire because language to me is really really important, like especially as a coach, language is really important. And really I've always gotten the feeling that strength isn't doesn't really exist in climbing in the way that I think we would think about it in most other sports. Like, I have a bunch of athletes that are pretty small. No matter what, I'm going to be stronger than them, just on size. Like if we're talking about strength in the way that it actually, like most people would use it, that's why we have weight classes in a lot of other sports. It's just easier to be stronger if you're kind of just bigger. And so really what exists in climbing is a strength to weight ratio, and that's really where it kind of goes to. And I think if that's where how we're describing climbing, if we're describing it purely on strength and its strength to weight ratio, you have kind of two variables there that you can change. One of them being your strength, and the other one being your weight. Um, and so this became a little bit of also a part of, okay, well, if I want, it was a lot about style. If we're going to start youth programs, and I have a lot of young athletes, I want the focus to be basically the idea is that climbing is a skill based sport, and we should treat it that way. That's the philosophy, I would say. It's a I think I like skateboarding. Skateboarding is a really good example because it's like really really high skill sport. Like you could imagine, doing certain things to strengthen your legs and stuff so that you can, you probably have to have some amount of ability to jump, and you want to make sure that you can absorb all these things so you don't get injured. But apart from that, like a lot of it is just, working on skill. And I think we go really quickly in climbing to this idea of like, okay, well, now I've capped out like the skill portion of it. And like the only thing now that I'm going to be working on is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Um, and so it's just taking that idea of, okay, well, this is a skill based sport. What does skill work look like? And let's try to, really make sure that the majority of our work is based around, yeah, skill work.
Yeah, climbing is definitely a skill sport. I I came from gymnastics. I always coveted strength. I think that there's something about strength that is attractive. And I mean, you've had so much success with your youth athletes and older athletes, and so I'm just wondering how. I don't want to get into strength when you're telling me how important skill is, but how do you think about strength then? Like, how do you know when that is something that needs to be addressed, or is that like just an afterthought, or does that take care of itself? Where does strength play a role then?
Yeah, and I think I don't want to be, dismissive of that as, as something that needs to be a part of everybody's climbing. Um, but I would say we tend to lean towards that side of the spectrum a lot more because, like you said, strength is very attractive. And it was interesting because oftentimes when we describe somebody as being really, really strong, like if you think of a scenario where you're like, whoa, that was crazy strong, it was usually because it was bad climbing. It would be like somebody's foot cut and they're just like holding on and they brought themselves back on or something like that. And you're like, holy moly, that was like a, like oftentimes I felt like a really impressive display of strength was also like not the best display of climbing. Uh, and so I think to answer your question, like I would love for climbing for my athletes issues to be a strength and conditioning issue because that's almost sometimes in my mind a little bit easier. It's like, oh well, now this is something that we need to work on. Like you've proven to me that you physically can't do the thing that you're being asked to do, and so that's where I would lay it out for athletes. I would say like and I'll talk a lot more about comp climbing because that's my world right now. So like really the question is are you capable of doing the things that are being asked of you at the level that you want to compete in, right? And can you do them for the amount of time that you're being asked to do them, you know um, if the answer is yes to that, then I think like skill work is going to be really more useful, and so we can get into a whole discussion about, okay, well, how do we assess that accurately? And I think that's like a challenge of coaching climbing is, well, really I think of setting as the context by which you assess, what you need to work on. This is true for anybody. This is whether you're like climbing indoors for fun or you're competing. Like the setting is the thing that provides the context for you to see, well, yeah, I wasn't able to do this thing. And then it's kind of the job of the coach at that point to be like, well, is that something that's important for us to be able to do? Like, is that something that you're going to be asked to do frequently?
Yeah, because it does seem really tricky to ever even say that strength is the limiting factor because that implies that a person is doing a move perfectly, gosh, whatever that might mean. And then you can say, yeah, you were really on point there with your technique and your approach and your rest. And what it is that you're too weak in your ring finger, like that's a very difficult thing to assume that everything is so dialed in. And so how do you find that out via setting with your kids?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the questions is the context good? And I think this is kind of like a bigger issue. And this goes to like a whole, man, there's like a big cascade here because at the end of the day, like World Cup setting is going to be very different from like National Cup setting. It's going to be very different from youth setting, whatever. Right. So, um, oftentimes, let's say you're an athlete that's training in a commercial facility, the context by which you're kind of deciding whether you're able to do something might not even be there frequently, so there's not a really good mechanism for you to evaluate yourself because maybe the climbing is there, but it's not of a high enough technical level. And the reason I say this is like oftentimes I think if the climbing is sometimes it's just like a technical thing that we kind of assume is not a technical thing. Like I think there's when we talk about technique in climbing, I think there's a lot of um, general overgeneralization of maybe there's a lot more nuance, I guess. Like there's a lot more to get better at. Like I think oftentimes just even like the position of I've talked about this before with people, but the position of your leg that seems like it's not doing anything as it's traveling through space, because most of the time if you're kind of climbing on a board, the plane is pretty narrow and the depth is pretty like you're on a two-dimensional plane and you're actually not often asked to be that far away from the wall. except for maybe swinging out and then coming back in or something like that. But like a lot of these modern like climbs require you to kind of like switch the side of your hips, right? And so there's going to be this foot oftentimes that's kind of going to be spinning you in a way, and learning, what that optimal trajectory, that's like very, very technical, and you have to figure out, okay, how do we work on that, and how do we actually learn how to optimize that? Like, those kind of things I think are really important. And if you don't have the kind of climbing that's demanding you to do that correctly, you're not even really given the opportunity to know that that's something that you need to work on.
Something that I'm curious about on this idea of language when it comes to this topic is that I always think it's easy to talk about beta, like your foot goes here or you put a knee bar in here. But in some ways that's not technique, and it's all about how you move between those different beta, move between the different things that we've decided is good beta on that move. Gosh, it's so hard to be specific in general at the same time about this stuff. So how do you talk to athletes and come up with language to help them describe what you talked about, where there's like this hip transfer? Like I can kind of visualize what you're talking about, but it's something that I think is really difficult in climbing, is that we talk about, hey, you should put your foot here, hey, you should like get on that foot, but like what does that mean? Like there's a million ways someone could do that. You could go into it dynamically, you could have your hips close to the wall, you could sag out, like you could generate from the handhold first or a push foot. Like how do you start deconstructing that? And I always wonder if you can add language to come up with a way to abstract and atomize a movement that then you can then communicate and learn, really.
Yeah, I would say this is kind of one of the things that I feel like I pride myself in being able to do well. But then at the same time, like even last year, I was like, oh my God, I've been doing this kind of all wrong. Um, so I think, I guess we're talking about from a coaching perspective, like what it cueing, like what does effective cueing look like, right? And so in climbing we have a lot of self-directed climbers, right? And then we have some that are being coached. And okay, what's useful feedback versus not useful feedback? Well, if we take like a move, let's say a toe catch, like okay, I'm gonna stand up on something, I'm gonna grab a hold, and I'm gonna catch a toe. There's so many parts of that move that happen in a sequence of time, right? And they kind of it's almost like they're stacking in layers. So I usually tell people what I really like from setting is things where everything has a job. So what I mean by that is like it's almost like these things have to work independently from one another over a period of time, where like this hand has to be doing this throughout the move, this hand has to be doing this throughout the move, this leg has to be doing this, my hips have to be doing all these things, right? And what happens often is like, well, if you start to focus on one, you start to lose information about the other, right? Because a lot of these things, the way our language works is kind of linear like this. It's going one after the other. So if you're literally trying to give yourself an instruction on how to do the move over time, it doesn't really work because of you're losing information here. And so that's kind of like the goal really when we start talking about, okay, when we're in almost like a flow state kind of situation, the value of it is that you're able to take in a lot of information and act a lot on a lot of information, but you've lost this layer of language because all these four things, if we just talk about hand, hand, foot, foot, all these things need to be doing things simultaneously all at the same time. And so when we're getting to a point of cueing somebody, what I'm trying to look for is language to describe something that I want them, basically like a feeling that the athlete is searching for. Um, and so maybe that feeling, in this context of like a toe catch, something that's really, really important for that to happen is this feeling of kind of getting over this one foot and basically creating this feeling of like time on top of this foot, right? So that might be this like one of the key components of this move. And so you have to start trying to figure out how to communicate in a way where, okay, I got you to find that thing where you're feeling that pressure on your foot, but now I don't want you to focus on the words that I told you. I need you to just focus on that specifically. And I think that's where I was going wrong for a long period of time, is that the feeling is really the important part. That, like, I'm helping you find something that you don't know is necessarily there because you just aren't don't have an experience to listen for all of these things. Um, so an example I would give people would be like, well, right now as it's like meditative practice, but like right now as we're sitting here, maybe you're sitting on a chair and maybe your hands are on something. If you really wanted to scan and be like, oh, okay, well, what is my left foot like standing on? What is the shape of that foot like on the thing that it's placed on? How much weight do I have pushing through it? Like, you can definitely start to pay attention to those things, but oftentimes it just drowns out, like fades into the background. And I think that happens a lot in climbing, where a lot of these things are we're not listening for them. And then, as a coach, I'm being like, okay, let's listen for this for a little bit. And then now your job is to actually be really present there in order to kind of pay attention to what that's doing.
Yeah, that cueing idea is so freaking important. And having a coach that can help you hear or learn the right thing at the right time and then bring it with you on that move is it's everything. And it's funny how sometimes the thing you say to one person won't work for the other person, maybe even if it is the same issue. But anyways, I'm agreeing. I love that. What I want to ask about that is that something that I really enjoy about harder climbing is that multi-variable requirement, that your hands have to do something in conjunction or in sequence or at the right time, coordinated with feet and hips and a dynamic movement. And something that I always struggle with is when I have a really complex movement, something that's really difficult for me, and I know that there's like four different things that have to go on. It seems like you have to be able to kind of separate them or chunk them into these distinct movements that then you must almost make automatic so that you can layer on another one. I'm wondering if I'm thinking about that right. And I'm also wondering, how do you break down a complex movement? Because just like you were saying, there could almost be an infinite amount of frames that you could break it into, or you could break it into very binary. You start here and you end there. Great. But when you're dealing with a really complex move, how do you think about breaking it down for an athlete?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you are thinking about it the right way, and I would say even more. I would say this is like the biggest mistake I see with people in their climbing practice. Like, if we're really thinking about practice, it almost feels like oftentimes you'll see the person just trying the move over and over and over again, and then they do the move, and it's like, yes, I did the move. Maybe you do the boulder, and then you're like, okay, on to the next one. The crazy thing about that is that you don't know if you did it. Like, sometimes you just do the right thing by accident. And so, because in this situation, you're kind of changing a bunch of things, and in a lot of ways, your brain is really good at doing this. So, like, when they talk about learning, and like, one of the things is essentially just a lot of repetitions, and a lot of failure, because in your brain kind of does the learning for you. Like, if you have some success, it'll release some dopamine where you're like, oh, that worked. And it kind of like signals to your brain, hey, keep keep tabs on this thing. Like, it knows how to kind of search back for things that you aren't even thinking about. This happens a lot when you're sleeping, and things like that, where you will oftentimes like be really frustrated on a task, and then the next day you wake up and you are better at it. And you're like, how did that work? Um, so I think for a lot of people, understanding how learning works is really important, because oftentimes we're chasing actually doing the move. And I think what you're saying is chunking it in a way where, okay, in the context of what we're talking about, like, let's see if we can, well, to rewind a little bit, I think this is one of the biggest problems with learning how to climb right now, is that there isn't a really good way to learn how to climb. Like, even what we're talking about, in, let's say you're saying that move, let's say it's like three moves up into a boulder problem. Like, already the cost to practice that move is like high, you know. And if the move is physically difficult, that's also, you know, something where in order to do skill work, like if you want to do a lot of repetitions, but you have to rest for 15 minutes, you know, it's not a great way to do skill work. So those are the challenges of learning climbing that I think are interesting, and that ultimately you have to try to, oh, okay, let's, if we're doing skill work, what's an effective way to do skill work, and how can we kind of like minimize the variables as much as possible? So, like you were saying, well, I have all these things. Yeah, I should be thinking. An example is like a skate is a very common move, you know, where you're like jumping to a volume and catching a hold or something, right?
Mhm.
But something that I noticed from people is they can't even, you know, I played soccer my whole life. So for me to get my foot into the same spot on the volume over and over again is not that hard. But I'll watch a lot of people where like their foot, they have no idea where their foot is going on to the volume. So this is something that they've assumed they have mastery over and they don't. And so um, that is like, well, let's just spend time figuring out how to develop control over your ability to, you know, be precise with putting your foot in the same spot over and over and over again, you know, without having to look at it or something like that.
What are, I don't want to take us too off track. Actually, this is a good, this is actually maybe the foundation. So something like being able to repeatedly put your foot in the same place, or not just do it, but also focus on that and know that that is part of the crucial, repeatable things that you can do when you're trying to learn a move. What are some of the other things that are just absolutely fundamental and foundational that people don't often do? And that idea of putting your foot where you think it should go is a big one, where I see this often. I do it with myself. Is it's like, look at the foot until your foot is there. 99% of the time, that's a really important thing to do. Sometimes, you know, I'm going fast or on siding or something. Maybe it's a big foot, but just this idea of placing your foot where you actually want it to go is really foundational. Is there anything else that you see people make egregious errors, even though it's a fundamental thing for a complex move they're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, and I even want to challenge what you said a little bit because, like, let's say in like slab, for instance, looking, you need to be able to start your foot moving and know that it's going to go somewhere without actually looking at it. Like especially when there's a target, because like, if you, and I don't know if we're going to be able to, for the people that are listening, you know, if you can imagine a slab and you're going to do this move and you look down, there's actually this space where your head is that might be important for your body to go in. So if you're kind of looking down towards your foot and you're actually watch there, you're not in the place that you need to be in order to do the move correctly. So it's almost like, okay, well, sometimes yes, you want to be able to put your foot somewhere and be able to know exactly where it's going. So you want to pay attention, like it's a really small foot, and you know. But oftentimes, if you're like kicking into a volume, for instance, you kind of need to be able to start the kick and know that it's going to be there without paying attention to it, because maybe your gaze has to be somewhere else. It has to shift to, you know, the holds and next holds in the sequence or whatever. But I would say like a few things that people do that, like how accurately they hit holds, you know. So like even on a, let's say on a moon board or on a tension board or whatever, if you know, if you overshoot the hold by this much and then you're coming down, that's, you know, force that's very different from like if I hit it, if I overshoot it by this amount and like my hand is basically there where it needs to be, if that makes sense. Basically, just the
Totally.
precision at which you're able to kind of latch onto things is like really important. Um, and I would say people don't generate momentum very well. Like that's another skill that I think is pretty under. Yeah, like that's something that I almost always have to correct if I haven't been working with somebody.
Quick question on that generating momentum. I've heard this talked about, this idea of rear wheel drive versus front wheel drive, the idea of kind of like arms first versus legs slash hips first. Is should momentum, like, in what circumstances should momentum be generated from your legs first, and in what, if any, circumstances does it come arms first? That's a, actually that's a really tough question, but
It's weird because for me that's not really in the legs either. Like a lot of like the modern stuff actually comes from almost like a deadlift, uh, where everything these things are kind of arms are straight and it's really just about driving your hips forward. That's usually the thing that I have to fix the most.
that's so interesting that you say that. Again, my background is in gymnastics, and that's the kipping movement that you're talking about. It's a hip extension, and it's how everything gets generated. It's actually not really your I'd say your legs and your arms carry that momentum generated from the hips through whatever apparatus, and so that's interesting. Okay, okay, I don't know if we want to go down there.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a loading. You have to load it and then you kind of snap forward. And then from that, that's like where you should be. Your arms oftentimes should be guiding, and you're driving through your legs.
It's just something that I've worked on more. I'm good at generating momentum, but I often find I pull through. I spend too much time on one foot and not enough time on 2 feet because I spend too much time on the moon board probably. And so I've gotten better at making sure that I am, when possible, generating off of one foot to get weight onto another foot to start my upward momentum. It's something that has really helped me where I almost have relied too much on my ability to kind of whip my hips into a movement. And just this idea of you can kind of generate the beginning of that momentum from any limb in some ways, and knowing when to choose which limb to start that chain has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and it should feel a certain way too. It's like, it's a lot about timing. So usually I'll say, well, imagine, your goal is to jump up into a bar and then do a pull up like simultaneously. That's how you're going to get moving the fastest. But you can imagine that you like over jump and you end up actually your hands don't do anything because it feels almost like there's no weight there on your hands, or you under jump, and you don't have enough, velocity. Like speed climbing is going to feel a lot like this because essentially you're just like trying to carry this momentum the entire way, and or you like mistime the pull where you're pulling on the way down. So a lot of these things are going to make you feel, honestly, it'll kind of feel the same way as if you're not strong enough and you don't have enough power. Um, and maybe certainly at some point it does become about that, right? Like we're trying to push the limit, but for a lot of people it generally isn't. Um, and let's say we start, yeah, we're doing this idea of like, okay, jumping into a pull up. What you'll start to realize is like there's a certain feeling that I should feel essentially on my arms and on my hands as I'm pulling, where like the bar feels useful, but it doesn't feel like I'm fighting it as much. And those, when we're talking about cueing, those are the kind of things where then now that's like the important thing to actually focus on, because you can actually act on that. Like, and this is where I want to go back to why the cueing is really important for a competitor. I don't get to talk to a climber once they're competing, so the only cues they can really rely on are these like, internal cues. They don't get to look at a video in the middle of the round. So if they need to act on information, and that information needs to be information that they actually have access to. So
Okay, that reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you about doing hard moves and learning things where this must occur in competition where you're flowing. So let's say let's say one is not in competition. This is because I haven't competed in a while, but this will happen in competition. It could happen in the gym or on a project. I'll go up to flash something, or I'll have my first attempt on something, and I will just drop into my body and intuit the movements and climb it well. And then I'll fall. And I come down and I go, okay, what was I doing or what did I do wrong? And sometimes I will struggle with moves that I did well because I didn't really know what I was doing. I just performed them well. And the reason I could see this being an important concept in competition is that it's great when things go well and you're just feeling good and flowing, but then sometimes you get knocked out of that and you're not taking that analytical approach. And so I guess I'm just asking, how do you balance this kind of flowy feeling? Like, some, are you really aware of, are athletes at the highest level always aware of what they're doing while they're doing it and able to repeat it? Or do they ever kind of get knocked out of that? Does that make sense what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of it goes to overthinking. Well, one of them may be, well, you weren't able to do the thing again because you got lucky. Like
Got
oftentimes you
lucky.
can just get
Yeah.
lucky. Yeah, like, oh, I happened to do all the right things at the same time, but it doesn't mean that you're, able to do that consistently. Um, and then another one being like, yeah, sometimes, especially like, let's say you did a lot of things well, but you didn't do one thing really well. Well, now let's say if your goal is to actually like, get better at that one thing, you're gonna have to shift focus to that one thing in some way, and usually that ends up maybe breaking some other things, and that I think that's okay to, if you understand that, then you can expect it and be like, yeah, honestly, in this situation, uh, you shouldn't hold on so tightly into this idea of like every, if I'm able to, if I did it once and I'm not doing it again, it's like I'm getting worse. In a lot of ways, I think we tend to be really, I feel like we feel oftentimes a little bit too fragile that way. Like, oh, maybe I've broken something, where the reality is like, yeah, you're going to go through these. I think in the development of mastery, you're going to go through these periods of like, wow, all of a sudden this feels really foreign again. And it's because you're kind of thinking about it a different way. And that's okay. Like that process in itself is valuable because what you're really looking for is control. I think if you have really good control over your limbs and where they're at in space and, that is is really important.
I just rarely see top competitors fail on the move that they've done before. Sometimes you can see them get really tired and they, drop something at the end, but it always stuns me how consistent they are in their attempts. There is typically linear progress. Not every single time, but I always am astounded by that. And sometimes it makes sense to me where they're doing a big coordination move and you can see them break down the pieces and they don't do it. They get a little further and then they kind of have that move on lock. But I'm just stunned by their ability to not take two steps forward, one step back, like I am. Where and even in that case where I'm saying I will flash a move and then struggle to repeat it, I'll still probably be able to unlock it. But what I find is I feel like I'm using more energy. I'm like kind of forcing it. I'm not doing it. I'm like just bearing down and being like, I know I can do this. And then, but that's not really mastery. That's forcing my way through a move. And so I'm just inspired by their ability to be so consistent.
Yeah, and I would say that's also like part of like performing. I don't think that's necessarily so much about even mastery of the climbing itself, but like starting to develop a mastery of like performance. In a similar way to when we're talking about like uh, the kind of people who, I play the guitar and I play the guitar and I sound okay when I'm at home by myself. And if you ask me to go in front of somebody, I'd just like freeze completely. And it's like you have to practice being able to kind of execute when, you know, I need to do this now. And I would say it does happen. I think we oftentimes like really focus on the ones that are doing it really, really, really well. But there's plenty of people, there's lots of people in qualifiers and semifinals where I'll watch and they'll be like their first attempt is the best one and they can't really get back to that high point anymore. And I do think part of it is like your first attempt, you really don't have uh, that many expectations in a lot of ways. And then once you have information, I think there's this weird quality about bouldering that makes it pretty difficult to get kind of in a flow state because you're kind of like forced to come to the ground and like have time to yourself thinking about what you should do next. And I don't know that that's necessarily that's I think how that's approach is really important because if we're talking about how we were queuing before, if now all of a sudden you're thinking like almost assessing yourself in this third person of like, well, what did I do and what do I need to be doing? I don't think that's great, you know. So I don't think that's usually conducive to like really optimal performance. I think it's good practice. It's like good thing in practice then.
How do you have athletes handle that? almost inevitability that they're going to fall and have to kind of be analytical during that round.
Yeah, I almost don't want them to be super analytical, you know. I think some of the, you know, I almost think, okay, well, if we're having to be really analytical, then we're maybe trying to learn the move in the middle of the round, and it means that we haven't seen maybe that move or that kind of climb. It's like something about it is making us feel like we don't understand, and so we're then having to get into this perspective of like, okay, well, let me try to figure this out with like my logical brain. But really, like that logical brain is like not very good at rock climbing, you know. It might be good at like thinking through problems, but it's not great at rock climbing because again, it's now thinking in this very weird like what are these steps type of thing instead of your brain that you know they show whenever you have athletes in like flow, they're not really firing as much, you know. It's like the quiet eye and just this idea of you're kind of just reacting a lot more. And so I think the more I always want it to be more like you're reacting to a stimulus. Okay, I did something, I felt something. Now I have to rest for a bit and I have to, you know, react to what I felt and trying to do it in the way of like, oh, this is relating to me in a way that I've felt before, and this is how I've reacted in the past to those things, you know.
So that makes perfect sense on a competition scene. And I'm a big fan of climbing via intuition. I just think it just feels good to be in that reactive state instead of asking questions to yourself about why you're reacting a certain way. You're just kind of feeling it, letting it go. But I definitely have situations where all of a sudden I get knocked out of flow. It could be that I fell, it could still happen in a competition. It could be you're on sighting and you're feeling good, and all of a sudden you come to a spot and you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't feel it's a very visceral feeling where you get kind of knocked out of that moment. How do you what do you tell athletes when all of a sudden they do drop into that I know you say don't drop into that analytical state, but maybe what do you do when you get knocked out of flow and you're in the middle of a round?
Well, I think you start to kind of basically I think when you do get into that place is that starting to develop like this really you're becoming really self-aware, you know. It's like you're here, you're here, you're climbing, but you're also here like trying to uh, critique, you know, your climbing, um, and being really aware of that and maybe the crowd. And so oftentimes I think that's where it's really useful, like mindfulness practice, where you're doing a lot of things to kind of like bring attention to what you're feeling currently, you know, like um, trying to bring everything as much as you can into the present moment. But it's hard because you're still getting this anxious feeling of like the time ticking down. And so I think a lot of these things, the way I tend to just work with these things in general is okay, if it happened during round A, I can't tell them right during a round. So it's going to be a conversation that we have afterwards. And okay, maybe it seemed like you kind of snapped out of it. And let's try to stay present next time. And maybe here are some things that we need to kind of try to work on to be present. But it's probably then something that I end up writing down and being like, hey, this is somewhere where we need to be. Because usually it came from there was something that happened in the boulder. Like you said, you have your intuitions, but your intuitions can just be wrong, you know? And so sometimes it's really about retraining your intuitions in a way where it's like, well, my first instinct is to do this. This isn't actually the right thing in this situation. How do we? I'm clearly picking up on some information that's not, I'm acting on it in the wrong way. So maybe an example would be like, you see this frequently with people where like they do a move and the first thing that comes off is their foot, but they don't even know that it's their foot that came off. You know, it's like their hand, or they think that their hand blew off or whatever, right? Like they weren't even aware of what happened necessarily, um, and so they're acting on this information that they think is right, but it's not really the right information. And so clearly, we weren't in a place where we were able to pick up on the fact that what actually happened was like that your foot came off. Um, and so that's something that we need to work on.
This idea of getting knocked out of your intuition because you're trying to learn on the route. Yeah, you're trying to learn a move because you aren't able to just react to it is really interesting because I think that it puts a big onus on you as the coach and the athlete that they should have such a wide repertoire of just ability to react to almost any situations. And we know from talking to route setters that that's almost like what they're trying to do. It's like, you haven't seen this before, like, gotcha. So how do you train that with athletes so that they have, how do you give them the ability to basically tackle not just any move they've ever seen, but even variations of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can take basically our brain is really good at extrapolating like certain information, right? Like this is the cool thing about bouldering is even if they have done something like it before, they've never done something. They haven't done that exact move ever before, right? Like unlikely, maybe the position, the starting position feels kind of similar to the ending position. But I think if there's something there, if a lot of it feels similar enough, right, then the gaps that you're trying to fill in are small enough that your brain does a really good job of like, imagining what maybe that will feel like. And we can talk, if we talk about just like climbing on a board, like even if you haven't climbed it, you kind of have an idea of what it's going to feel like, right? And I think if all of a sudden that those two things don't match at all, that's really where you get snapped out of it. You're like, whoa, this doesn't feel like anything I've ever felt before. So like, what am I doing here? That's, something I'm doing here is wrong. I'm missing something. And so I think trying to create as much of like these really as big technical chunks as we possibly can that kind of occur in a lot of climbing, as much overlap as possible. Because even let's say I set a move for a particular person, like they see a move in a comp and they're like, wow, I really had a hard time with this. And then I set the move for them and they work over and over and over and then they finally do it. It's really hard to know that the person didn't just do it because now they've been working on this particular move for 30 minutes. It's like you can just learn that one move. So this is why I oftentimes don't really, there's a lot of, this feeling of like, oh, I need to do it because I need to, once I do it, I feel like I'll have this clear insight into how this move works. I don't think that's always true because if you're spending a lot of time on it, sometimes you do kind of the thing that we're talking about where like, yeah, I'm kicking my foot into the right place every time because now I've done this like exact kick 30 times. So I'm getting better at doing this. But does that mean that I have a general good ability to put my foot exactly where it needs to be all the time? Maybe not, because maybe all of a sudden, something changes that does enough to make it feel unnatural. And that will, that's enough of a change. And I think those things are more important to practice than like these really specific moves. Like, um, yeah, and I think that's been one of my bigger projects in general this past year is starting to categorize climbing in ways that are a little bit more feel like bigger technical chunks. If I ask somebody, okay, think of like climbing technique, most of the time they'll be like, well, a heel hook, toe hook, or something like that. But I think there's also these like really kind of key movement patterns that are actually like these pretty big chunks that we need to make sure that those are also being done properly over and over and over again. And then it starts to build on itself like a lot faster. So a lot of these moves that I think we think are very, very different have at their core kind of a lot of really big similarities.
Can you give me some examples of those categories?
Yeah, so I think right now like really popular is the Lachey, right? So I try to break things down into basically right now for dynamic, this is going to be mostly for dynamic climbing into throws and catches, right? So like, and then I have this other kind of thought around extensions, which is like things that you do to extend the throw. So like a lâcher is a kind of throw, right? And generating out of a lâcher is generally like something you should and can practice over and over and over again. You don't need to have a lache that's set in your gym. Like even if you take a jug and you're swinging around it, and like let's say, oh, this is the kind of thing that I would do is like, okay, well, we're gonna go, let's figure out how to practice a lache. Well, maybe let's find a hold, and we're swinging, and you know, your job is to just swing and land on this spot. Create a spot on the pad. We're being like, okay, your job is to swing and then land on the spot. And then now we're trying to think, okay, like what are the things of this throw that are making it difficult? Well, sometimes like people are really okay with like swinging front to back. Sometimes they're not great at swinging side to side. Things start spinning. You'll see this all the time. You will see it even at the Olympics. Then people will have to kill basically their swing and start over because once you kind of get twisting and doing it, it's like really hard to fix, right? So that's a skill that you can just work on its own and understanding that throw. Now, an extension would be something like, okay, once you land on the spot, maybe you have to change directions on a volume. So another type of extension is like a paddle. You're essentially like, you might be doing a really similar throw, and now you're doing this like extension of the throw through a paddle. And all those things, you can break them down and then start working on the individual components and making sure that you're doing those components really well. And then you're going to be much better at, okay, well, if I need to swing off a lache and land on this volume and then redirect, basically like change directions on this volume, I know how to do that. I know what that feels like.
Dude, Al, the reason I'm over here just shaking my head and being like, geez, it makes total sense to me what you're saying. And I understand this idea of chunking techniques. And forgive me for using an gymnastic analogy again, but it's the reason why I use this because gymnastics is a much more distilled, simple sport with easier repeatable patterns. And so you have kids do like hollow body rocks, which is kind of like almost like a C shape, and then Superman's, which is like an arch shape on the ground. You have them block, which is like if you put two arms above your head and push. And the reason why you do that and you do that over and over again is because in a swing, you do a hollow body shape. When you run and you hit the vault, you do a block. You do the block when you're doing a back handspring. It's very clear that this is a component of skills that need to be performed. And then that you add on like extensions, all this. But the reason why I'm shaking my head is that, and not in a bad way, just I'm admiring the task that you're undertaking, is that gymnastics takes place on the same floor, the same vault, the same everything. And when you look at the way the skills are, it's like, wow, good backflip. Okay, now do two backflips. Two backflips is not that different from one backflip. It's really not. And what blows my mind about climbing and why it's so difficult is like, grab this crimp. Okay, then this crimp. Okay, this crimp is spraggly. Okay, this crimp is like really good on their back two or whatever. And that's just one freaking handhold. It doesn't even take into account the dynamic element. So, I'm shaking my head because I'm stunned by the enormity of the task to try to abstract and distill building blocks and then build on top of them. And I would love to hear more about the different categories and how then you think about, is this something you then take to your students in the very, very beginning? Like how do you then build up an athlete from the bottoms up?
Yeah, I haven't done one yet. I think that's like so much of this has been just experimenting and trying to figure it out. Like I do a lot of I most of my inspiration is coming from like all sorts of different other, like jujitsu is a big one for me because jujitsu is also extremely open-ended in that way, but they have like an enormous amount of breadth in terms of like how they drill stuff, like really complicated sequences. And especially positionally, it's a person that you're doing this against. They're never going to act the same way. um, but like so much of it is that you're drilling to a point where like, oh, okay, as soon as I'm put in a position, my body knows what it's supposed to do to some extent. um, there's this really interesting book that's called The Art of Learning, which I read, and it was pretty
I
interesting. And I
love
had
that book, dude. Holy crap. Okay, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, but I think like some of the ideas are pretty hard. Like at first, it's I think he has some terminology for some ideas that are really hard to understand at the beginning, but one of them being form leaving form, which is kind of this idea that you have a sequence of steps to do something and you're drilling them so that essentially like the goal is that this becomes this thing now that is kind of formless in terms of the steps. And to get to that point, I think in climbing, like you said, is really challenging, but that's what's fun. That's what I enjoy about coaching climbing and not, why I wasn't really drawn to coaching a lot of other things that I've done in life. Um, yeah, it's a hard part, but I also don't think that I think there's a lot more overlap in these building blocks than we think. Like enough there.
So I've talked about that guy who wrote that book, Joshua Waitskins, a few times on the podcast because I think that he's brilliant. And the thing that I'm going to bring up here is that he talks about doing jujitsu and how you have a starting point and an ending point, but that the better you get, the more frames and steps there are between that beginning and ending point. And so, and there's an infinite amount of steps. And so it's all about all of those steps, not just like starting in the right place. And I think about climbing like this. And that brings me to my question around route setting and what role that plays in teaching these skills and how you go about adding extensions. And just, can you talk more to me about how you use route setting to build these athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally route setting is like coaching, uh, and I don't really distinguish them a lot, and I think um, because of what we're talking about with which is without the route setting, you don't really have context to coach. I think if you don't have the right, I talk about like coaches all the time that struggle with that because they're like, well, in our gym we never really have the climbs for our athletes to like train on stuff. So how can you even make decisions around like, oh, this is what we need to work on because this person did this, and so a big part of it is okay. We even from designing, I don't even really kind of just say route setting as putting up boulders in a gym. I think route setting in like a bigger picture thing is about designing the environment for a person to like learn how to rock climb. Uh, and like that's how I would like people to think about it. Then when you're stepping into a different, maybe you're stepping into a role of like a chief route setter. That's like a different role than being like an assistant route setter for a comp. But at the end of the day, you're kind of trying to um, you're looking for something for the athletes to kind of interact with this thing that you've created in a way that is going to fit the job that you're playing at that point in time. So for a route setter, it's going to be a competition, maybe in a competition setting. But for me as a coach, I'm trying to retrain those instincts that we're talking about that aren't you know good instincts. So if the setting allows things that I don't like, for instance, like if this person is able to uh, you know swing around on holds, one of the most uh, solidifying things in climbing that makes us feel good is like doing a climb, right? So if the person is constantly getting rewarded for behavior that's not necessarily going to be good for what we're trying to do, they're going to be like, okay, this works, and they're going to continue to do that, right? So the climbing might end up trying to basically get the right kind of behavior out of the athlete. So maybe at first you're just like, oh, I don't this person tries to always go slow, like in a situation where they actually have to switch gears and like perform this one kind of bigger move. They have a tendency to not do that, And sometimes what happens is because works really well all the time. So if they can always kind of take the move and change it into a way where, they can slow it down and kind of mitigate all the risk, it's going to be really hard if they know that that continuously works then in a situation of high pressure where they have to do that in 5 minutes for a competition to not do that, you know? So somehow you have to start to retrain the person to be like, hey, that what you're doing there is actually not going to be, get you the results that you want. And you show them that through the setting in a way that's going to, you know, provide the context for the athlete to try to change that behavior.
When you put an athlete in this environment and you hopefully craft it in a way that the lesson, I don't want to say is forced on them, but something like that. How do you know when to interrupt or interact and give them the solution? Like what is your role as a coach once you've set up this environment for them?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing is like this is where I it's basically what we're talking about is like a constraint sled approach, which is just I think something that climbing lends itself really well to, which is I think it the coolest thing for me about setting is that it can be this explorative like experience for the person that's climbing, where I think one of the things that really I think attracts a lot of us to climbing in the first place is that you're trying something over and over and over again. And it's like you stumble onto the solution. It's like, oh, I just needed to do this, right? And so I think ideally, if they can come to that conclusion on their own because they're trying it and over and over again, and it's set up in a situation where they can try it over and over again, and they do that, I think that's going to stick way better than anything else. So I try to interject as little as I can, So frequently right now, for instance, it's like our spray wall. I reset our spray wall, and it's been taking forever because I'll watch the climbing. Basically, I'll make boulders on it, and I'll watch the climbing. And if the climbing looks like what I like, in terms of I think the athletes, it's demanding the right thing of the athletes, then cool. But then oftentimes it'll be like, oh, this hold actually allows for some things that I don't really like, and I'm constantly tweaking it. And so my approach will be more like than likely that I'm going to change that than I'm going to try to like, tell the athlete to not do the thing or do the thing that they're doing, if that makes sense. Now, once we get to a point where okay, we are we know that the level is appropriate because I think what we're talking about also is like sometimes the level is just inappropriate and that the climb is just too hard. From a skill building standpoint, it's not really that useful. Um, and so that's where I'm saying, well, let's bring it to a point where you can actually be at the right challenge at the right level where I think you're going to learn in a good way. It's hard. You can't really do that in a gym, frequently because you can't just like walk in and start taking holds off the wall or moving them or something like that. So you have to start to develop some tactics yourself when you're climbing in terms of like how you basically avoid making climbing feel so binary where it's either you do the move or you don't do the move and everything in between is just like banging your head against the wall trying to do it.
It it seems really it seems, I don't want to say obvious. I understand what you're saying. If you had a single athlete and you could set a boulder or a route for them and adjust it as needed continually. But how do you do that when you have 15 people of not just different skill levels, but different sizes and shapes?
Yeah, so this is kind of like setting it, this is what I'm saying, not so much from just thinking about it as a one boulder problem, but it's always about thinking about like facility design. Okay, how do I get the most bang for my buck in terms of like, you know, take this small space that I have and how can I have it serve the most amount of people at the right level? Um, that is always something that's very challenging, and I think that's just a challenge of climbing in general, like learning to climb in general. I mean, even just thinking about like, for instance, when you start climbing, the amount of climbs that are available to you in a climbing gym percentage wise is really low, right? So maybe there's a move in some boulder halfway up a boulder that could teach you something, or like let's even say places that have roots. Maybe there's a move like halfway up, some 511 or something that could really benefit you to try over and over again and learn, but it's locked away by another like 20 moves of climbing over here. Um, like I think it, learning to climb right now is not many places are set up to teach people how to climb.
So, not everyone is blessed enough to live in San Diego, period, and get to train with you, Al. What would you say to someone, well, like me, or someone who's a adult and doesn't have access to a facility where the setting is teaching them? How do you go about learning climbing if you don't have someone teaching you there, and maybe you don't have a big selection of routes?
Yeah, I mean, I think my first question would be like climbing what? Starting to narrow your focus in a way of like, okay, what is it that you like to climb, you know? And because I think oftentimes like if you're there in a way, I think there's plenty of people that go to the climbing gym and maybe their objective isn't necessarily to learn how to climb. I think it kind of happens as a byproduct of going, but I think they're just there to maybe just climb for fun. And if the learning happens, that's cool. But I'm going to try the new boulders of the set, and that's that. But I think there's plenty of holds on the wall, you know, and you're going to have to start to develop some sort of deliberate practice around what it is that you're trying to do. And I think the space oftentimes has a lot of the things that you need, but you'd have to start to think about the climbing gym in a very different way, um, which is not really how gyms are designed. They're like at this point, they're telling you kind of which climbs to try and what the difficulty of them are. But like if you're a competitive climber, for instance, I think you should start to if I'm saying, hey, setting is such an important component of understanding climbing and movement, and you don't have something that's sitting there for you, like you should really learn to start making boulders for yourself on in the gym.
Okay, I'm gonna push back on you a little bit on this idea. I think sometimes that people do just want to go and have fun, but I think a lot of what fun is just getting better at this quote unquote thing called climbing, like this fundamental skill. And something that I've talked about with you and with others, that competition climbing seems to actually beget some of the best quote unquote climbers. And although they're just in competition, people will say, "Oh, how would they do on real rock?" And it's like they do really well. And because there's something about that kind of movement and that kind of setting that begets good climbing. And so I guess helping us understand what these principles are that you're trying to drill into them. That's what we've been talking about this last hour, is good, because I think that people actually just want to have success on as many variety of climbs and as many variety of styles as possible. And it just feels good to tackle whatever challenges in front of you. So I think even when people just want to have success in climbing and just have fun, that what fun feels like is success in unexpected challenges in whatever the gym may throw at them at the time. And so, yeah, I guess it's kind of a tricky question to ask what someone who's just in a normal commercial gym should do. But I think that's what we're trying to tackle this whole time, is like, what does it really mean to master climbing? And how do you do that?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I agree with you in terms of like what I think people should like, what drew me to climbing and what draws a lot of people to climbing. But I think this is not necessarily, I don't think that, especially from a current like gyms, the trend that they're going on, I don't think that they're treated as this way. They're not treated as a place to teach people how to climb. They're treated as something where um, people are consuming something. Like it's a business of consumption right now, and the consumption is climbing. And so that does kind of change how people interact with climbing, because maybe it becomes okay. Maybe it is about just doing all the boulders in the new set, uh, and but that set might, if it kind of like, it's almost like the tail wagging the dog in some way, because then it becomes about the setters. I mean, this is almost like a complaint of any setter that I know at any commercial gym, is that they can never really set as demanding as they would like to, because oftentimes people will get really frustrated. But imagine what a crazy experience you're asking of new climbers, which is like, hey, walk into this building with just hundreds of boulder problems, all of which you have no idea how to climb, and figure it out on your own. you know I think what that's going to create is going to create climbing where it's reasonable for the person to essentially have a lot of success without any guidance and any help. And really, what a lot of these comp climbers are doing is a lot of them are getting coached, and they've even just completely changed their. I think their goal is often to get better, like even at the expense of not necessarily like if you watch it's crazy because I think if you watch a youth climber going to a climbing gym, even if they're not like physically crazy strong, they will literally consume all the climbs inside of a gym in a very short period of time, you know and this goes just to, I guess, more just like a general gripe about climbing gyms, because I think um, one measure for maybe what a good gym could be is like, oh, how many new climbs they have, how frequently do they set. But something that I thought is a little bit more interesting in terms of posing a question to like a person that goes into their climbing gym frequently is, how many projects do you currently have in your gym? Um, and that, I think, is usually a pretty low number, even for a very large gym. Because I think that we've changed the kind of the thing to be more about like, okay, well, now there's this new set, and then now I'm going to move over to that new set, and I'm going to climb all the things that I can climb on that new set. And usually then after a certain point, if it is a very strength based kind of setting, you do get to a point where it starts feeling pretty binary. I can either do this boulder or I can't, and I kind of can go back to it, but it's almost one of those things where it's like, well, if I had a few months, then I would probably be able to do it. And there is some tech. I think oftentimes that is not necessarily true. There is something technical there that can be done, but it the nuance is going to be hard for the person to pull out if they don't have the support of being like, hey, this is kind of what you can do different.
Especially if it's at a limit project where they are being asked to do understand some nuance that they are now only encountering 4 moves deep on something that's really powerful for them. Yeah, I mean, Al, I understand what you're saying there, and I don't think that climbing gyms are going to change to make it more learning focused. I don't know if that's a bad thing either. Maybe it just gives rise to a different style of gyms and people like you to coach, and it makes me think of like people used to like to just show up and brawl, and then boxing was developed, and that rigor of understanding how to stand and throw a punch is very different from just people like, oh, I just want to go and show up and fight, which is a very different thing. So yeah, that's too bad. Okay, well, while we're still then on the competition style and learning, we had this chat earlier about just what the most important skill a competition climber needs to have, and I just thought it would be fun to kind of go into that as a very simple topic. Just Al, what's the most important skill a competition climber needs to have?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about this is, take this. I always say like take these with a very big grain of salt, because I'll change my mind, in like a month maybe. And I just the conviction with which I say it is usually not like really indicative of how true it is or anything. It's more just that I think when I do put myself into this position of like I really think this is important, then I'm going to work a lot towards like figuring out how to improve that. And I think right now what that feels like is because of what we were talking about, where you're never doing the same something that you've done before. It's basically, you can imagine the circle, which is kind of the idea of physically what your body is capable of doing. You know, in this big circle lives stuff that you basically, anything that literally, if somebody took over that, and you could pilot in a way like, it's physically capable of doing all these things because of your flexibility, because of how strong your hands are, because of, how strong your shoulders are, because of your creativity, whatever. And then there's like this circle that lives inside of that, which is what you can imagine that you can do. Um, and I think for comp climbing, most people, this circle is like quite a bit smaller than the one we first started talking about. Um, And a big part of that is basically what we've been talking about. Like maybe they've never experienced something like it before, so they don't even know that that's something that their body's capable of doing. So you can imagine anytime you're like learning something or trying something really hard at your limit, you're kind of like creating a little bubble. You're like poking out of this, and maybe you're expanding it, hopefully, so that next time when you are, introduced with something like that, you're like, oh, I think I can do that. I've done something similar to it. But it's basically this idea of um, that you can imagine that you can do all the things that your body's actually physically capable of doing, you know? And then there's another part of that, which is like, once you imagine that, can you actually execute it? Can you execute it in the amount of time? But I think a lot of people don't really, if they don't know their limits really well.
Do people? I feel like sometimes I think I can do something that I can't. Is that rare? I feel like maybe my eyes are bigger than my arms. Is that common or uncommon?
I think I prefer that because at the end of the day, I think like then you can kind of move back. You can kind of like try it. At least then you're trying it and you're like starting to test where those limits are. But a really good example is like from something that maybe just isn't as obvious. Like one of them being like, oh, well, I think a more obvious one would be, oh, can I hold on to that hold? Like I probably can't. It's like very, very small. Like you feel it and you're like, wow, there's no way. And then you do it and you're like, well, I can actually. Um, but another one being like, oh, can I stand on this foot? Like if you're on a slab and you imagine this volume that's like very, very low profile, and like from the ground, if you assess that, well, yeah, there's no way I can just balance on that, right? Because you just don't understand the limits of maybe like friction at that angle. You that doesn't even occur to you as a solution. But what if that is the solution? Then we're never going to get into a position to actually do the climbing. Like maybe you'll get lucky and you'll get up there and you start to feel and you're like, okay, maybe I can. But um, generally, if your body is able to do all the things that are being asked of you, going back to the one of the first things that we talked about, if all you could imagine, like all of the competition moves in a comp live inside of that circle, right? And and you can imagine doing all those moves, that then I think we're in a really, really good spot. If those moves live outside of that circle of what your body's physically capable of doing, then that's what we were talking about, where it's like, okay, well, how do we get ourselves in a situation where we can do all the things that are being asked of you? Or maybe they live inside of that circle, but outside of the one where you can't imagine. And now it's approaching the practice from a different standpoint, which is like, okay, well, how do we get you enough exposure to these things so that you start to realize, oh, this is something that I can do, and I need to see this as a possible solution.
That's a lot of circles to have to stack and
It's just two.
execution.
It's two.
Well, there's the execution of, I guess it's the applying that, connecting those two and making sure that you're actually able to execute your imagination using your body, because we're not marionetted robots that can just do it every single time. And that actually gets back to that performance aspect, which I'd love to ask about. But before we go into that, I I know you do a lot of low angle work. We'll say slab work with your athletes, and when I'm outdoors, I think I'm pretty good on slab. I don't know. I'm not great. Just I'm like, oh, I can trust this foot, and I've gotten there because I'm like, I could never trust this foot, and then it works, and you slowly build that understanding. But I struggle indoors on volumes and jibs, and when I get on these comp style, quote unquote, comp style problems, whatever we want that to mean these days. Uh, I I struggle to understand how to use them effectively. Like, do you have any kind of basic tips for people when it comes to putting weight on your feet on low angle terrain?
Well, I think oftentimes it's partly like this is like low hanging fruit, but like, are the shoes good for that? I think is often one of the first things I'd start out with, because I think it is hard to learn good technique without the proper. I mean, basically, you can it's similarly like if you go climbing in slab in Yosemite or something, and you have like a super soft shoe, you can definitely still do it, but you're going to climb very differently. You're not climbing, you're kind of leaning back into it a little bit, and you're like edging, like you're smearing on edges and things like that. And it's similar for like standing on really bad smears on volumes. Like there's a reason why so many of these root setters forerun a lot of this stuff in approach shoes. It's because it's, and it has very little to do. I think a lot of people will say, well, surface area. It doesn't really have so much to do with surface area. It just has to do with it's less about the shoe rubber and a little bit more about how flexible, so that your foot, it allows your foot to sit in a position where the force is going in the right direction. So that's really where it's important. But basically this just goes to, now your job is to start testing your limits. You're saying, it's really nice when somebody shows you, right? Just shows you that it's possible. The problem is when you don't have anybody that can even show you that it's possible, you have to imagine something that you don't even know if it's true or not. But it's kind of one of those things where it's like, well, get up there and stand around on this foot and like bounce around on it and start to feel what that feels like and where the limit feels of friction feels like in that, and you start to become more comfortable in it. It's not that much different than doing that on outdoor slab. You don't, it doesn't work unless you put weight on it. That's kind of like one of the paradoxical things about that kind of climbing. And then you do it, and then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, it held. And you start to build a feel for it, which I think is the other important thing that you said, is like, what it feels like when something's going to hold versus when it's not going to hold anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the hard things about doing these kind of indoor slab problems I'm thinking about is outdoor slab. I typically do have super, super stiff shoes and I like that kind of edging. You kind of just like creep up. It's like 1 foot, like it's not good to take big giant steps. You want to kind of tick tack up. I mean, I'm making a generalization here, but that's kind of what's worked for me. But then indoors, often it's a request to completely move into the finishing position aggressively while trusting this foot, in the sense of like you have to keep in the right place, keep pressure on as you then get all your weight over it and get your all your weight over it into the exact position perfectly and not be too off. So that's like there's a lot more factors going on, a lot more variables that often make it really tough for me.
Yeah. Add to the, just real quick, I think it just add to the fact that this could be like, if you're trying to learn that and it's like 5 feet off the ground, you're at the feeling of, feeling insecure on something fairly high off the ground. That's not a really good place to be learning, something for the first time. So it's again where I think, if you find feet that are low to the ground that are really bad in a gym, and you start playing around with standing on them and feeling what it actually feels like to be like fully trusted and like leaning in a position where if it does go, it's going to feel pretty scary, right? But now you're not 5 feet off the ground, and so you can actually start to develop a little bit better intuition about it.
This is why it's tricky with the gyms the way they are. Can you imagine someone just going into a gym and just playing around on 1 foot on the volume and not because they're on a route? It's like that's somehow antithetical to how we expect people to behave in the gym. Be like, "What are you doing over there, man?" "Oh, I'm just trying out this foot." "What do you mean?" Okay, I you said something about visualization when it's not right there in front. If you can see someone do a move right in front of you, it really helps. You go, "Oh, it goes." Right? So, how do you deal with doing moves that you haven't seen in front of you and that visualization? Because I assume that, I mean, that's kind of what competition climbing is. And any practices on visualization as a whole, but especially when you have to try to visualize yourself doing something that you've never seen before and aren't sure you're capable of.
Well, I'll encourage everybody to do something next time they're climbing, which is start to actually really think about how they visualize climbing in the first place. Like, kind of sit there and be like, okay, I'm going to, what, from the moment you start thinking about what you're going to do, what you're about to do, like really start to think, okay, how much, what am I feeling? Am I in the third person or am I in first person? Am I watching myself climb? Like for me, for instance, it's I'm going to watch myself in third person, but I'm going to feel in the first person, right? And then start to think about, okay, how much detail can you actually abstract from this image that you're creating? Like, can you see your hands really clearly? Can you see, essentially, if you're in third person now, I can maybe think about, okay, I can see my legs doing something throughout the entire move. How much detail can you actually see? And then the other thing that I would say is, I mean, this is maybe a plug for a camera that I use, but basically, we have this camera. It's called a Mevo Start, and it's just like one of the few ones that I've found that does this really well. But it's this camera. It's like $400 or something, so it's kind of expensive. But it's a live stream camera that it itself can connect to the internet. So the nice thing about it is, like, oftentimes you don't have to connect it to a computer that's then streaming. It'll stream to YouTube, and then I'll set a private stream that you can watch. So I'll have it set up almost every time in front of the spray wall, and with an iPad going where it's always, the stream is going. So if you don't, the nice thing is you don't have to turn off the camera to watch the video. You just can scrub through the stream, right? And this has become really important for us because I think taking a video of yourself is really difficult. Oftentimes you have to set up the camera, start it, go back, look at the video, set it up, start it. I think that's enough to make people not want to do it. Um, but essentially you can start to create a practice around, okay, you imagine what you're going to do. Like, you create as clear an image as you can. You try the boulder. I would encourage, before you go and look at the video, to kind of take a second and be like, what did I feel? And almost, maybe if it didn't go well, think about, what do you think it looked like? And then go back to the video and look at the video and then be like, oh, that actually looked exactly like what I thought I was doing, or that looked nothing like what I thought I was doing. And now you're just playing this game where you're like, okay, well, then it's this next try, I'm going to create a really clear image in my mind about, I'm going to do this. Maybe like we're talking about this foot. Clearly, we've identified that this foot is doing something weird. Okay, I'm going to really picture this foot doing the thing that I want it to do with as much, feeling as I can. Try it again, go back and look at it. And all you're really trying to do there is start to create a connection between, what you're feeling, what you're seeing in your mind, and like checking it against something and be like, does that actually look like what it, I think it looks like?
That's sweet, having like tightening up that feedback loop of thinking what you're going to do, trying it, and then getting instant feedback visually as to what you actually did, and trying to close that gap. You said that when you visualize, you talk about feeling it in the first person, but seeing yourself in the third person. Why do you, yeah, why do you see yourself in the third person versus just being entirely internal? Because I think I'm always first person when I visualize.
Yeah, I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that I'm just more watching a lot of people climb all the time than like myself climbing. So I'm almost, I can also just like switch the person. It doesn't have to be me. I can imagine like other people, and I can feel what they're feeling. So like if it's a kid, I'm pretty. That's like, I would say, like, if I had a, somewhat of a superpower as a coach, I would say like that's kind of like that would be the closest thing, which is oftentimes when I'm cueing people, I'm just describing to them what I feel in this situation as we're doing the move. And it just happens to be that, because I've watched a lot of climbing and practiced it a lot, that I'm pretty okay at it. So it's like I'm trying to give them something to look for. But this is something that's always interesting that I ask for people, just to see how they do visualize climbing. Because, for instance, um, yeah, a lot of people do visualize themselves in third person and climb in first person and feel in the first person. But then I usually ask them, okay, well, then now at some point when you're walking over to the boulder, you're not in third person. You're the person climbing. And what is the thing that's going to bridge that gap? And usually the thing that bridges that gap is the feeling, right? Since I still felt in the first person, I know what the holds felt like. Now when I'm like there and starting the climb, it's kind of the thing that kind of bridge the two things together, is this feeling. Um, does that answer your question?
100%. And it makes me think that as time goes on and we do more video analysis, it might become more common for people to have those kind of distinct things. I this is just way off in tangent world, but it cracks me up because I studied philosophy, and there's this book Sartre, and he talks about being and nothingness, and he and the idea is that we have this weird thing as humans where we bounce between kind of third person and first person, and how we're always looking to combine it. And you made me think of it when you talked about people falling from a boulder and then all of a sudden being aware of the time limit, the crowd, but really you just want to focus on the climbing. And it reminded me of this idea where if you're a waiter, you people act like being a waiter. You're like, okay, I'm a waiter. I need to stand like this, but you are a waiter. You're doing that job, and I'm always fascinated in the the meeting of those two, and that's kind of like that flow state and how to adjust it, because it can be really powerful to see something from a third person, and it can be really detrimental to see it from a third person. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, look, I look so silly. Look at me, and then you're very self-conscious in this bad way that can be really destructive. But also, there's a tool where I was thinking about, if you view yourself from a third person in general in your visualization, the power that might also unlock is more awareness about holds and body positions that may be kind of outside your narrow focus zone. And so I just wonder if that was one of the reasons, was it allowed you to kind of have a coach's eye on yourself at the same time as feeling and getting that instant feedback. So yeah, sorry, big
Yeah,
tangent there.
no, I don't think it is. I think it's a really important thing to kind of touch on, because I think what you said is really true. This was also a thing that I realized was a bit of a mistake from my part, because again, because I'm watching so much climbing and I'm actually not climbing as much, I was assuming that most people's like visualization way that they visualize things was the same as mine. So this is where I actually started asking a lot of the athletes, this question, because I want to more just adapt to what they have in a way that's going to be really useful. But going back to it, because I do think at some point then you are that person. You're not in third person. You are that person that is going to perform the climbing. So I even experimented with like having conversations. Well, it also depends on whether that's already happening. Maybe that step's just happening naturally. Like I said, for some of the athletes that I talked to, they're like, well, the connection was once as soon as I get on the wall and I'm feeling, it's like, oh, it brings me to this is me and I'm doing it. But this conversation almost of being like, okay, well, let's try some things in the sense of basically like standing in front of the wall, because you imagine yourself in third person. Now you're standing in front of the wall, you close your eyes, and now you're seeing yourself in the third person in front of the wall. And now you're going to kind of walk into yourself so that when you open your eyes, now when you open your eyes, you're in first person, you're seeing what's in front of you as like this climber standing in front of the wall. So I think there's kind of like these are the things that I think people, when it's going really well, don't re- don't really think about it too much. But I do think this is why there's so much volatility in bouldering competitions, is because people are snapping in and out of like performing, and being in a really good performative state.
Okay, I want to talk more about that ability to perform and what to do when athletes struggle with it, because I I will be at the boulders or at the gym, and I will feel people watching me, and I feel like, oh, I'm supposed to do X, Y, or Z, or flash or send. And I am like trying to pull on. I feel like I'm looking at myself in third person. And then when I can snap in, maybe I climb well. And I often say this about, I think good etiquette, just a PSA, is like, let people have a moment to climb. Like, don't be talking about baseball while someone's pulling on to their project, because just let them hopefully have that little bubble. But I also talk about how this is one of the reasons why I enjoy sport climbing or even competition so much, is because I feel like when I'm far away from people, I'm able to kind of drop into that moment. But if you're an athlete and you have to perform, you need to be able to do that. I don't know if on command is the right word, just that is a habit that you've built up. So what do you do with athletes or regular people like me who want to be able to perform in these moments and they feel like they're struggling to enter into that zone that they need to be?
Yeah, I think this is where like the group that you're with is really important for that exact same reason, right? Because it is, but the cool thing about bouldering is that, but it's also one of the challenging things in the same way that we're talking about is that you kind of develop this behavior where you like go and you're like really in want to be in the zone, and then you come back and step back and you sit down, and all of a sudden you're having a conversation about something. You're picking up basically a conversation that you had before there. And I would also tell the athletes, like, is the conversation a break from the climbing, or is the climbing a break from our conversation right now, or whatever it is they're doing? So it's a little bit of like you're it's mindfulness practice in the sense of, well, sometimes when you're having these sessions, it's unlikely that for, like, let's say an hour and a half of whatever you're climbing on, that you're going to be very, very focused for the entire hour and a half. But can you create moments of, 5 minutes at a time where you are focused, or maybe 5 minutes in your entire practice, and just start building on that as much as you can, so that you know what the things are, the cues that are kind of getting you in a as soon as this is where I think rituals are really important from like a competition standpoint. Um, and it's really nice for bouldering because you can create these rituals. Well, the minute timer goes off, and then I can do the same thing, during that 1 minute. That's letting me know, hey, this performance is about to start, and something that you have control over that you can kind of do every single time. That's signaling, hey, this is like my time to be really focused in my own climbing. Um, And I agree with you with sport climbing. That's what's really cool about sport climbing is it's almost like you're tied into another person, a belayer that's walking you out. You're the only person. You have a spotlight on you. The moment you step on the wall, the next time you're coming to the ground, you're done, you know? So it does create this almost like walking through the tunnel at like a stadium feel, where you're like, whoa, this is not practice. This is like me going out to do something that I think bouldering, it kind of can lull you into this weird sense of, um, you start hearing somebody off in the distance doing something, you're watching climbers next to you. It's very distracting. So the answer to a lot of that stuff is that you are assume that this is my philosophy for a lot of things in coaching. But if it can live on a spectrum, as quickly as you can kind of assume that this skill is on a spectrum where you can, it's not either you've mastered it or you haven't, but something that you can get better at. That's a kind of a step one. Okay, this is something that I realized is something that I can get better at. And now you start putting your attention there as like, this is something that I want to improve. You'll start to, if you put intention behind it, you will get better at it. But if you don't really see that as something that you can get better at, um, and don't identify it that way as something that's important for you to get better at, you probably won't.
Well, I'm glad you just shined a light on the idea of having a ritual of recognizing that you can take pulling on to the boulder, we'll say, seriously. That like there can be a moment there, and I will again encourage people to, in their crew, help people with that by saying, by stopping talking when someone walks up to try, and then I often like, let's see it, like, you got this. You just something to let the other person know that the focus is on them, and now is a time that we're all quiet and we're here being supportive. I know that's not always realistic. Like, I think last time I saw you was in Bishop, and I'm probably like, you walk over to High Plains Drifter, and there's babies. I'm one of the people who probably brought that baby. There's dogs. There's people laughing and drinking and having fun, and it's something that I think has changed in this sport as it's grown. And maybe for better or for worse, it depends. I'm not going to complain about people going out and having fun at the boulders and it being beautiful. But if you want to do your best, you have to make space for you to do your best. And so I just, the fact that you even shine a light on that being something you can practice and a habit you can build, I think is really, really powerful for people in competition. But yeah, I'll try to get better at Al. I promise. I'll,
Yeah, and I
I'll
think you,
practice.
but one of the other things too is being really honest about what you said, which is that you start to feel like the weight of people's expectations. And I think this is really a really true thing. This is one of the reasons why I think we see young climbers perform really, really well. It's because a lot of people don't know who they are necessarily. And so they will throw themselves at stuff in the gym. Like they will kind of train in a way where it's a little bit way more playful. But, as soon as it, it's not super common, it is a little bit more now. But let's say like a lot of these athletes, if they're training in a gym, just, like a climbing gym. It's very cool that you can go and see one of your favorite climbers at the climbing gym, but they for sure will be very cognizant of the thought that like people expect them to be able to climb a certain way. But that's not really the place where you need to be if you're going to practice. You need to be pushing yourself to the point of failing constantly, and that's you know it's a hard place to be if you have expectations built around the fact that you are really good and everything should be really easy for you.
Yeah, yeah. You got to be willing to suck before you can get better. And I just want to share a tiny little anecdote. I remember Jimmy Webb talking about Daniel Woods and how Daniel will sometimes, sometimes a move has his number. It might be a V10 move because he's still Daniel Woods, but to be honest, a V10 move can be embarrassing for someone like Daniel Woods to struggle on. And Jimmy said that Daniel will just go after that move with reckless abandon as if no one was watching, not, just go for it. And he's Daniel Woods. I'm sure the expectations on him are high. Uh, and I just thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Uh, one more question. This kind of most important skill for competition climbers. I don't know if this is exactly the most important skill, but you talked a little bit about settling. This idea of settling. What is settling, and why is it important?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a basically creating language around. I used to think of climbing really positionally, and I think that when I coach, like many people probably that worked with me will be like, okay, well, you're climbing. I would say climb the positions and not the holds, and I still do feel that way a lot. But I think one of the things that I didn't like about describing things that way is that positions feel like a snapshot in time, and some of the things about that are really really difficult about climbing are like, yeah, when you're doing, if you think of a barn door or something, there's a point from when maybe you start interacting with the hold and the foot, and you're starting the barn door where like that in itself is a chunk of like technique, essentially we can think of it. And a position then would be kind of the end of that, but now we've lost a lot of that information. We can think of these two positions, and then there's this sort of um, idea of like maybe I'm on double gastones and I jump to something and I'm swinging out that, yeah, maybe at the end then I'm in this position. So it started being around. I started thinking more about kind of how I talked about throws and catches, where that was like a way of essentially trying to categorize movement and like giving pictures of people, because I think catches now carry a lot of information about feeling and time, how things happen and evolve over time. Um, and so then it basically spawned this like just throw, catch, settle, throw, which was basically a cycle for like a kind of climbing, which is like a very dynamic style of climbing where it's you can think of it like you throw. The dynamic climbing, essentially you can think of it as like you're throwing and catching yourself is what I'm getting at. And whenever you kind of initiate this catch, if you watch people who maybe aren't super proficient in this kind of climbing, you can have like this toilet bowl effect sometimes, where like you'll jump in and maybe you're swinging around on some holds, and that is very fatiguing, and if you, especially like, if you start summing it over time, that's really can add a lot of yeah, you're losing a lot of energy there. And so the settle is essentially this transition from once you've initiated the catch to basically getting ready to do the next throw. And it's basically this part of climbing that really doesn't contribute much to you getting up the wall, but it can contribute a lot to you basically falling before you should. Um, and it happens in some obvious ways, like the one that I just talked to you about, like the toilet bowl situation. But in a lot of ways too, like what we were talking about before, where maybe you overshoot a hold you come down onto it, and your shoulder is still very engaged. And then, at some point, maybe you should be then relaxing back into a position like that. Like settling into that position before you go again is pretty important. And you can see how that adds over time. So like if you consistently are not, you know, settling well um, on a sport climb, you're gonna carry a lot of tension for a really long period of time, and you're gonna get more tired than you should. So it's the settle is a little bit like it informs maybe the quality of the throw, because maybe you threw yourself into the catch in a way where you added a spin. You know, you threw yourself where maybe you added the spin, and now you have to fix the spin by like using extra energy to settle yourself back in, like put your feet back on the wall and get ready to do the next move. Um, so it was a part of this basically idea to try to again create language that we can talk about, and also create intentional practice around saying, okay, well, maybe mastery isn't just doing this move, but now we're going to do this climb a bunch to try to see. You can see the settle, it happens. you know Sport climbing kind of helps you a little bit where your chalk bag, if your chalk bag is like bouncing around a bunch, it's not a great, but you can kind of see it and be like, hey, how can we remove as much of that as possible when we're doing this climb? uh, and that's basically what the idea comes from.
Okay, let me repeat it back to you because I think it's interesting that you can almost you can almost understand a lot about how a movement was initiated or executed and the efficiency by which it was performed by the time between each move. Like if you throw in a way that is not so great, that's causing you that toilet bowl catch idea, then that time to settle, that control, getting back control for the next move is a lot worse. And so just that space between each move tells you a lot about how the move was executed and about how much energy you spent doing it. So in some ways, that's like a big insight. It's like you can tell a lot about the move between the moves. Gosh, I said that like 3 times and I couldn't come up with a better description. But is that kind of am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and it was kind of a lot of it was around sport climbing, and kind of understanding that like if you're using a lot of energy but you're not really getting up the wall, you know, I think that's somewhere where you can try to remove that as much as possible. Like, what are the parts of, if you watch yourself on a sport climb and you're like, what are the parts of this climb that are actually contributing to me finishing this route? Um, because we can all imagine that there's like an optimal way to do every move, for each person, right? And if the person can do each move optimally, then they're probably going to get to their high point. And the other component of it is that, like, did they manage their energy well? Um, but I think the settle is a big component of basically, like, for really really good climbers. I think the catch kind of just blends into a settle where the settle almost doesn't happen. It's almost like you can imagine this drive by. Um, like narrow kind of position where you're kind of jumping through, and the way to do it kind of correctly is to create this tension by jumping through and then kicking back. And then when you kick back, you're kicking back exactly into the next position that you're going to go into, versus like doing this and then swinging around and then kind of like then taking some time. That swinging part is not contributing much to um, you performing the climb. And in a lot of ways, if you're going to climb at your limit, you probably have to remove that. And so just ways of trying to think about how to like optimize that as much as possible.
Al, this is why it's so fun talking to you is and why you think differently is everyone's so focused on the move itself, that binary, did you complete the move or not? And then looking at the space between moves, really helpful. And then even the way you were describing that right there is interesting because what you're starting to do is talk about how each move leads into each other and how climbing at your limit, it's almost like a mistake to then use that language where you're talking about just this position, that position, because if you don't understand the climb in its entirety, or at the very least in a series of moves, you're really giving up a lot of finer nuance and detail that then leads to inefficiency, which yeah. So that was not basic fundamentals. That was some interesting insight.
Yeah, and I think going back to like the form to leave form kind of idea that we talked about, the art of learning, like at some point, I think if you do create like a really clear image in your head, this just ends up being this sequence of things, movements that you do that you imagined that you're going to do to get to the top. You know, it's not like uh, there isn't so much of a step there that I'm going to kick here into this thing. Sure, like you are going to kick there if somebody were to describe it to you, but really it just is this idea in your mind, and it's like really clear. Like to me, I can, you know, if I create this move in my head, and to answer one of your questions previously, like the way I communicate with my athletes a lot is through just like miming stuff out because it carries, you know, maybe as I'm talking, I'm also doing these things where like, oh, they can see that I'm rotating through space this way. So it carries a lot more information than just, you know, what I'm asking them to do.
Yeah, yeah. And then picking up these language or creating this language that have these lots of ideas contained with them. It's something that I always think about when you pick up a new subject, or this happened in philosophy, is you'll hear some description of something and each of those words has a whole series of concepts built in. And when you understand the vocabulary in, in almost anything, whether it's physics, philosophy, economics, climbing, it's often not that crazy complex if you understand the concepts built into the vocabulary. So we have to develop a vocabulary that we all understand to then tackle some of these nuances. And so again, applaud you on that. And that brings me to this idea that we talked a little bit before about case studies, and that's actually how you and I started talking about settling. And I want to talk a little bit about these case studies you perform, but with a quick little disclaimer that the reason why we haven't named any names about all these wonderful elite climbers that you interact with is because you interact with them in your capacity as being part of the US team. And so when we talk about climbing or case studies about climbers, we're not going to name any names because it just isn't really appropriate given your capacity as a US team coach.
Yep.
So so yeah, if you want to say anything more on that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, what are case studies? Why do you do them? And what's kind of the output of the case studies that you do?
Yeah. So I mean, it's not something necessarily that it's like, oh, I'm writing a dossier or something on a particular person, but I guess like there's particular people that are just really, really, uh, that'll basically just they have something exceptional about them that I like to try to understand what that is. And, you know, I mean, I will name this person in this case because I think it's okay. But the essentially the concept of like throw, catch, settle, throw was a lot around watching Serato climb when he kind of came up onto the scene. And he's just one of my favorite people to watch climb. And it was around creating basically like, oh, what is the reason that things look really easy? Um, and it's a lot about what we've talked about, and at least this is again my interpretation of it. So it's something around, okay, well, this person is showing a lot of success in a new way, in a way that's like pretty unique, and I find that unique like take on climbing is something that's probably going to feel really important, and it's something that I want to teach to my athletes, and starting to kind of like develop some sort of way of actually coaching that essentially. Um, that's kind of the whole reason behind it is, oh, and that's where the whole idea of like throw, catch, settle, throw came out of, was essentially just like watching this person a lot and starting to understand, okay, well, like what are the things that this person is doing really, really well. Um, and I think they're just really useful in the sense of um, what's really cool about climbing is that you can have such different approaches to the same, you know, problem. And for our athletes, I think they something that I did growing up a lot was watch players play soccer and then try to imitate them. So there was a period of time in my life where I was like, I'm going to play like Messi, or there's a period of my life when I was like, I'm going to play like Ronaldo or whatever it may be. And I'd try it on and I'd be like, oh yeah, that I like this, this is good. Or I try it on and I'd be like, this isn't me, you know? And so this is an opportunity for a lot of these athletes to start to figure out how to, oh, maybe how do I try this on? And I like how this person is climbing, so let me kind of emulate the climbing. And how do I create a process around like emulating that climbing? And what you end up is essentially just like, yeah, some cool new ideas around coaching. And that's really why I do it.
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting about this case study practice that you do is that no, you do not write up a whole dossier. You actually distill it down to a phrase or a sentence. And what does that say about elite climbers that you can do that? That they exhibit something that is worth abstracting into a sentence. Does that make sense what I'm asking there? It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
just like the practice of doing it, but what does that say about climbers?
Well, I think I've said this to a lot of people before, but the cut, for instance, the cut from semifinals to finals in bouldering is 20-6. It's a really, really gnarly cut. So it's like the reality is you have to be exceptional at something, because if somebody is better than you, if you're really good at this one thing, but this person's better than you in that thing that you're really good at, that person will probably take that spot in finals, right? So it's a little bit about, I think a lot of these people that I tend to kind of like try to study and learn from, um, tend to be the best at that thing. And that's a big reason why they're in finals consistently. That's why they're performing at a really, really high level, or at least that's how I interpret it. And so I think it speaks a little bit to the landscape of finals, like trying to make a competitive final. And standing out essentially is important, because you do have these four boulders or five boulders or whatever it is. And it may just come down to, did you do that one boulder quicker than somebody else? They could be really good at that, but you're just better, and that might be the reason. Like there's some people that are exceptional slab climbers, and for a period of time, maybe that was like 3 years ago, where I was really, really obsessed on slab climbing and understanding what are the things to, because oftentimes people were just making finals because they did the one slab in the round, you know. So that's basically where that comes from, if that makes sense.
Definitely. So when you are when you look at these exceptional abilities of these elite athletes that demonstrated some kind of exceptional ability, which is lets them be a finalist, when you're trying to understand what they're doing and then help coach your athletes, what does that say about plugging weaknesses versus leaning into strengths? Because you're not going to out, or it's unlikely, or no, it's you're never going to out Serato because if you're trying to be Serato, you're not Serato. And just like you were saying, when you tried on Ronaldo's hat, you, you're not Ronaldo, you're still Al. And so how do you think about balancing people's strengths and weaknesses when you're trying to be the best they can be?
Yeah, I think that's part of like I've been playing, like I was saying, I was playing a lot of guitar, and I think something that is, and speaking of language, of something that some people mention all the time, like you'll hear all the time people ask musicians who their influences are. Um, and so much of that has to do with like, at first you're kind of imitating because you really enjoy that sound, and you're like, oh, I want to sound like this person. And through that process, you end up sounding like yourself. And that's ultimately the goal. It's like almost like you start a little bit of creating a caricature around this person, where you're like, oh, how would this person climb in this situation? And then through that, you start to learn a lot about yourself. And wait, we're not the same in this way. We're very different people. But at the end, it starts to morph into, well, it's just me, you know. But I think it's really important for people to like create a style. Um, I think in particular for climb climbing, like a style, I think creating a style, it helps with your decision making as well, in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of these climbers that we're seeing that perform at a really high level have a style, it, and it's kind of clear. And you can almost, so I play this game all the time where I'd be watching the person, I'd be like, I think they're going to do this on this boulder. And I encourage people to try this because I think it's a really good practice. You'd be like, okay, you kind of created this idea of like what this person's, capable of doing, what they like to do, and have you watch, and you'd be like, oh, I think they're going to, this first try, I think they're going to try this. And then you watch and you're like, well, yeah, they did try that. And that's a fun game to play.
Yeah, it makes me think about how I apply that to myself, or how us non-elite athletes apply that to themselves. And it's this ability to look at a climb and develop an intuition about what your way might be. And I've struggled with this a bunch, where I will fail on climbs that I see other people trying, because they will struggle on a move that then I think it's going to be hard and it was really easy for me, and vice versa. There could be a move that they find easy, or I'll get sucked into beta that may be good beta for 95% of people, but especially when you're near your limit, it's not your beta. And I don't know how yeah, how do you encourage your athletes to lean into a specific style, and and actually also, when is it appropriate to do that? Both, like, is there a level or a certain type of move, or sometimes it might be really tempting for me to say, I don't like small crimps, so I'm going to dyno. But what if that dyno is 5 times or 5 grades harder than the crimp move, and I'm just kind of shooting myself in the foot because I want to do my style?
Yeah, I think this is like, as a coach, that's also part of what you're doing. I would say like, I think I am going to make some assessment on a style that I think is better than others. At the end of the day, part of the other reason why I really liked, doing these studies on these things would be like, because this person's style is really effective, and I do think that they are understanding something about climbing that I think is kind of fundamental to like where the sport is going. Like this is like tracking towards how the sport is changing, and they're going to continue to be successful for a long period of time because of this style. Um, so you do make decisions there. It's not like and I'm encouraging some of the athletes to like watch certain athletes that I think are going to be, like a cool, the A that I feel like they're going to be inspired by. They're going to be like, oh yeah, this is really cool. I can see myself climbing like them, but that I also feel like are, climbing things well. And that's just me, you know, my opinion on those things.
In your opinion, where is the sport going now?
Um, where is the sport going? To be honest, I think the the sport will continue to become much more technically demanding than physically demanding. I think that's like a trajectory that it'll keep going. I think if we take a picture of like, take a look at climbing gyms or climbs in general, like 5 years ago, and look at them now, like things are tending to get more three-dimensional, right? There's like a lot more space that the athlete has to be able to like basically know how to move themselves three-dimensionally in a way that they didn't have to. So I think the trend is going to continue that way. It's going to be more technically demanding in terms of like more degrees of freedom, more places where you can kind of like spin or swing, and the holds are going to change a lot. And I think the holds are going to dictate a lot of where the sport is going to go to. Because I mean, we saw, for instance, like the no tex holds. Um, that's going to, if those are being used frequently, that's going to kind of change the direction of how movement is going, compared to maybe a lot more use of really large volumes or something like that. So I'm mostly curious. I'm really like excited. I was setting the other day and I had just this idea of like this boulder that I wanted to set, and it was crazy how much like engineering I had to do of like shoving things underneath other things or like blocking things. And you see this even at like World Cups where it's just like a lot of holds to try to, oftentimes it's just to try to get one hold have a function that they need. And I think right now there aren't the tools aren't there for the setters to do some of the things that they want to do. So I think the tools will get a lot better, meaning the holds will be able to create the movement that they want without having to do as much modification. And I think that's something that will change the game quite a bit.
It makes sense as a spectator and as a not very good route setter. Sometimes when I see these boulders on the Olympic stage, on the world stage, World Cup stage, I'm kind of like horrified by like the holds to get like that one little spike to stick out, because that's just not something you would typically do in a commercial gym. It's like, why are you putting this hold on top of this hold? Like, this looks ridiculous, but it makes sense what you're saying. And it's interesting that that's probably a sign that holds and volume shapes will evolve in a way to allow for these things that setters and coaches like you are envisioning. So that's probably a really cool insight there, man. Um, okay, gosh, we've talked for a while. I got to ask you about the freaking Olympics, Al. It I think it's a good question to segue into, because we're talking about the evolution of the sport and where it's going. The Olympics were amazing. They were an amazing show. I freaking loved it. Congrats to the team you are a part of. The US had a great showing, and it was such a fun thing to watch. So I, as just a layman watching, and I got to see you on the big screen, it made me wonder, what's it like? What's the nuts and bolts like of being an assistant coach on the U.S. team? You're in San Diego most of the time. The athletes that you work with on the U.S. team don't all live in San Diego, so clearly they're not your quote unquote athletes that you coach year round. So, what does your role actually look like as being part of the U.S. team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, for instance, for the Olympics or like traveling to World Cups, well, something isolation is really interesting. Like, I think it's a really interesting component of climbing that is in not many other sports. Like that literally you surrender your phone and all your electronic devices, and then you're kind of sitting behind a wall for a long period of time. And so a big component of it is like every isolation is a little bit different. Um, it was really cool for the Olympics. There was this. It's gonna stay there. And basically, it was this recreational center that had basketball courts, and that's where they built a gym. That's still there, and it was a really cool ISO. But it's gonna stay as basically like a community climbing wall. And so this was ISO, um, and it's always just like a spray wall, kind of like sometimes it's a really nice ISO, and sometimes it's not. This one was great, but uh, the athletes have varying ranges of things that they know for sure they're going to do during their warm up. But a lot of it is like, you know, setting boulders in isolation and um, really managing time. Like it's a lot of different things for different people. So a big part of it is that I do not work with these athletes all the time, but I do have a good relationship and track record with them. So it's like everybody's going to need me to different extents. And then some of them is also just like I'm supporting the head coach in doing his job as well as he possibly can. Like oftentimes, if I can do that really well, then in a really good way, I'm supporting the athletes. Um, so it's a lot of different things. And then afterwards, I'll be out on the floor and I'm watching, and sometimes I'm watching to make sure that the athletes are scored correctly and providing encouragement from the field of play. But then also kind of just picking up on things of like, oh, these are some trends that I'm noticing that might be actionable on. But at that point in time, oftentimes the athletes are really capable and they know kind of what they're doing. And it's almost like it's great if I don't have much to do, that I'm just kind of helping, making sure that the wheels are on the bus, but that's it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I was just wondering if there's some kind of like intake, when we get a new team member, athlete on the US team, because it's always changing, uh, do you all assess them and say, "Oh wow, yes, you're an incredible athlete, but we noticed this hole," or do you ever talk to their coaches beforehand and get kind of updated, like this athlete has been struggling with this, or this athlete is currently working towards this skill, or however you want to define it? Like, yeah, how's that handoff look, or is there a testing or intake involved?
It really depends because like some of them live in Salt Lake, and so they're working with the coaches there, and I think that's a better situation where there is some sort of, okay, let's assess this person and let's try to help them be the best version of themselves. But since I'm here, I'm mostly traveling with the team for competitions. Sometimes I'll go in for training camps and things like that. Um, but it really depends on the person. Like oftentimes, if I do know the coach that they work with well, and I do see maybe that there's something, oh, this is what I'm noticing, and like this would be a good kind of thing to focus on. I'll say that, but it really just depends on the relationship that I have with that athlete and that individual coach. And that's the tricky part about this job. I think it's really challenging in that way, and it's challenging in the way that it's hard to know. There's just so many different scenarios that you have to essentially interact with. It's not like it's a very different job from when I'm back at home coaching my athletes that I work with all the time. It's a lot more of like, hey, where can I make the first do no harm kind of thing, right? That's kind of baseline, and then afterwards being like, where is the little places where I can be useful, and trying to take my ego out of it as much as possible, of being like, sometimes it's useful to me, if it's useful for me to just like keep track of time for this person so that they know when things are happening or something like that, then that's what I should do. Um, and that is also partly due to the US being such a large country. It's just really difficult because people are coming from all over the place. But hopefully in the long run, I'm developing a relationship with them to where we're able to have conversations more and more after each round, and be like, talk about like maybe some things that we can focus on, and that's the goal. That's like what we're trying to go towards.
It's funny how small climbing is, where you probably do know all the athletes, all the coaches, and have seen them over the last 5+ years. It's maybe Al, I hate to say it, but maybe your name is not the biggest name in climbing for the average climber. Not everyone knows you, Al, but actually everyone who's competing or coaching does know you, Al. And so, first of all, thanks for coming on and sharing. Uh, I don't know if you're able to share this, but can you talk about what training camps are like for the U.S. team? It's okay if you don't go into detail. I don't want us to give away our secret sauce, but if they're like, what's training camp look like for a U.S. team?
Well, I mean, the last one that I was part of was actually like an international training camp. I think there's even some footage of it maybe on YouTube from IFSC, but it was like after the Salt Lake World Cup, everybody stayed. A lot of the athletes stayed and were welcome there to kind of just um, yeah, just all be able to climb together in a way that wasn't so super competitive, and it was awesome. I mean, I think for that, it's like I'm always first learning, to be honest. Like I'm trying to just soak in as much information. So it's like I'm getting to watch people and how they operate. Usually, there's such a difference between how everybody does things in climbing. It's crazy. It's like uh, nobody warms up the same. Um, like all the different teams have very different approaches, and I love that. It's like very cool, and I'll take any opportunity that I can to talk to people about why they do the things they do. So that training camp, for instance, was just like often it's just a lot of setting. Like it's about making sure that the environment is to a place where really you can set them off and you don't have to do anything. That's ideal situation, you know. And it's not that hard to do with a group like that because you give them part of the reason they're so good is they'll take any sort of situation where they're able to kind of get something out of it, and they will get a lot out of it. They'll make, if they have a spray wall, they're really good at making boulders for themselves and other people. You know, if you put somebody else in that situation, they like this is very common. You might put a group of people in front of a spray wall and you're like, hey, you guys climb on here, and they will have no idea how to make boulders, together. Um, so it's not difficult. And I think in that it's really cool. I think the training center in Salt Lake is really good. It's set up in a really good way to facilitate that. Like even just the spray wall. The spray wall is like awesome, and watching them just kind of make boulders with one another. For the same reason that we're talking about, what I can imagine somebody could do versus what these guys can imagine that they can do on a climbing wall is very different.
Can you go into that a little bit more? What does it mean to create? What does it mean for an elite athlete to create good boulders for themselves?
They're just really, I mean, really creative. I think they'll they won't see like if I'm standing in front of a spray wall, oftentimes it's like I'll see boulders, but maybe I'm not even being creative enough in terms of what I think people are capable of doing, right? Because they've explored that so much. They've seen they've climbed on a bunch of different spray walls. And so they'll just, what I mean by good is more just like, wow, they use holds in ways that I wouldn't have really thought. Like they create these moves between holds that I was like, I wouldn't have thought to, use those two holds like that because I just didn't think it was going to be possible. Like I think if you can set them off on that, and this is something that I watch Japanese team warm up oftentimes in like the Salt Lake World Cup, and it's watching like five or six of them like in front of the spray wall, just making boulders with one another. It's crazy. It's by the time they go out, they've done so much climbing in ISO, and I think they're thinking very creatively by the time they go out. So it's a cool exercise.
You said that you see people warming up a bunch of different ways, training all these different ways, and that's one of the cool things about climbing. And I agree. And my question is, do you think we'll start to converge on a right way? Currently, it doesn't seem like it seems like the types of bodies and styles that have excelled in climbing have actually grown compared to if you zoom out or if you go rewind 20 years ago, there was actually a very typical looking climber. And it's surprising to me that it's actually become more diverse in ways that have worked. And I was talking to Tom O'Halloran, who was an Olympian for the Tokyo Olympics for climbing, and he said that one of the things that struck him in the Olympic Village was just extreme morphology. It's like, oh, you're a weightlifter. Oh, you're a swimmer. Like you fit into some stereotype of morphology that is clearly for a sport. And so I'm wondering, do you think as we progress in climbing, we're going to see it converge to like, this is how you warm up, this is how you train, and this is how you look? Or is that something that maybe climbing is more unique?
I think it'll remain pretty unique in the sense that we don't know what it's not like we know what they're going to be asked to do at any comp, you know. So you can get an idea, and I think you will have trends, but I think those trends can just continue to shift over time. Um, and I think, um, yeah, like for instance, I became really obsessed this last year, 2 years about like warming up to optimally warming up for sport climbing because there's such a wide spectrum of like, oh, you got to get like brick pumped before you go out, like this amount of time. Oh, I never get pumped at all. This very wide spectrum, and it was because this, when I got this opportunity to just be in, to be able to talk to some of these coaches, I was like, let me see if there's some common threads here in terms of how everybody's thinking about it, and it's really not. And a lot of people are very successful, and it I think still comes down to that. There's a lot of ways to not only uh, successfully train, but a lot of ways to during a competition successfully manage your energy and like climb a route. You know, like some people take a very different approach, And maybe if the challenge starts becoming more homogenous, where it's like these are the skills that are being tested, and that becomes something that is very similar every single time, then yeah, I think the morphology will start to like change a little bit more. But there's the X factor, which is that it's almost two, I see it as two performances. It's not just the performance of the climbers, it's also the performance of the route setters, and they're like people in their own right, like essentially having an event where they're trying to do their best. And that's what's really cool about this. It's like we're going to continue to have these two very kind of different branches of the sport, where you can have different chiefs and from a different country. Like right now, we're seeing styles that are very different from France to Japan to Korea to China to the US. So it's like maybe the morphology might be one way in the US, but might be completely different in another country. And then when they meet together at a World Cup, like what is good? Who knows? I don't know. So
I love
it's
climbing.
cool.
I
Yeah,
love
it's
that,
really
man.
cool.
That is so cool. Good answer. Last question on the Olympics. And again, we don't have to name any names. Just what did you take away from seeing the biggest competition we've ever done and seeing some of the best competitors in the world? I mean, even just being on the US team, you get to see some of the top climbers in the world. But when you go to these World Cups and you went to the Olympics, like, just do you have any kind of pithy case studies? If you did a case study on the Olympics, what would be your one sentence summary of the Olympics?
Well, I think it became really like the passion of it was incredible. Like in a lot of ways, it felt so much like every other World Cup because I go into ISO and it's the same coaches and we're all talking about the same things. And I have this moment where I walk out, and as you walk out of isolation, you're kind of like on this road alongside the venue, but you don't really see the crowd. You can't really see the wall. But I heard the announcer, and the announcer was like announcing Sam Avizu climbing, and so like a French climber like about to start, and the crowd going insane, like absolutely insane. And it's it's the same thing, but it was just so clear. It's almost like you saw this level of passion that was really crazy in terms of you can tell how many of these people this is like their inner child is experiencing something, um, myself included, right? Where I there's like this part people kept sending me where I'm like calling Topsis Boulder in finals. And it was like one of the coolest things ever. And I went crazy, like the camera shows me going insane. And I was just like, man, you get wrapped up in it. It's just, yeah, experiencing like a dream that a lot of people have had in their childhood. And it's like kind of realizing it's happening. And the power of that was pretty overwhelming, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm a little beclamped just hearing your description of it, Bam.
Yeah.
One moment. Yeah, congrats again on realizing that childhood dream, and just also happy that you guys put on such a good show that it makes me think there'll be more Olympics to come.
Yeah. It was awesome.
Good stuff,
I
man.
was really glad. I mean, and I'm really happy to hear that because again, being part of it, sometimes you're not really sure. But I've had so many people come up to me because they saw me on there, um, and they were like telling me how much people that I don't generally would think you can tell that they don't really watch comp climbing or something like that, coming up to me and telling me how fun it was and how like awesome it was to watch climbing at the Olympics. And that's good. I'm really happy. That's like it could have, easily just not been the case. And hopefully it continues to be something that we're all really excited about.
Well, shout out to the athletes, shout out to the coaches, shout out to the route setters. I think you listened to that pod did with Garrett Greger a week or two ago, where everyone plays a role. It all did come together. So thanks for doing that and for taking us there. And that'll lead me into maybe my last question, Al, and that's how do you go from good to great?
Yeah, you asked, I think I know that you asked this for everybody, and I was like, my my initial kind of reaction to the question is, what does it mean to be good or great? And to me, I think the most important thing in getting better at something is to approach it with uh, intention. And so I think first off is starting to create a really clear picture around what it means to be great in climbing, because it's going to be different things for different people. And I think once you start to create a really clear image in your mind about what it means to be great, then you can set off to try and accomplish that, and you can actually start to create essentially what we talked about today. So much of it was exactly that. Oh, what do I think great rock climbing is? First, we have to create like a philosophy around that. What is great rock climbing? And now, once we have an idea of what great rock climbing is, we have kind of like a true north where we can check things against and be like, yeah, we're going to make, I'm going to design, some sort of training plan for this athlete, or like practice routine for this athlete in order to kind of meet that goal. And I have a, now I have something to check it against. So I guess my answer to that question was a non-answer, but I think starting with defining, if people really spend some time to even just think about like, oh, what would it mean for me to be great at rock climbing? I think a lot of those questions kind of start answering themselves as well.
Yeah, if you don't have a goal, or if you can't define something, how are you going to take steps towards it? You, we did talk about this for the last 2 hours, but what is that philosophy on mastery of client? I know we started out with that, but maybe we can kind of summarize it now that we've wandered around exploring it. Is there any way that you can take us back to that beginning and talk about your basic philosophy, not using the word strong, about what mastery looks like in climbing?
What does mastery look like in climbing? I think I'll say, if I didn't coach climbing, I think climbing is the vehicle for me to do what I really, really love to do. Like coaching climbing is the vehicle for me to help people gain mastery of self. And I think the real kind of thing here that I would say is like, we really are going to have a hard time of getting mastery of climbing if we don't have at least some, we're not on the path to gain mastery of self. And so much of that is, how do I learn, you know, like how do I create habits? What are the things that I'm able to, basically, how does my brain work? Like when I want to change a habit, like what actually works for me in terms of doing these things? Um, what are things that I have a hard time learning? Like, what is the reason behind that? Like, how can I essentially get myself to discipline myself in order to follow through with some of the things that I want to do? Like, to me, those are always, it almost everything then goes back to that. Um, and so much around gaining mastery of climbing with the athletes has really just been about first talking about, okay, if you really do want to change this thing, you want to become better at this thing, and this thing happens to be climbing, and I'm here to help you along on this journey. We first have to figure out a lot about you and how you learn, and I have to help you help yourself. That's really what we're trying to do. Um, and that's what really inspires me to do this job. It's like the climbing is just the vehicle for me to do that.
Jeez, man, you are a coach. That is exactly a coach answer. That is so good. It. I was going to say this earlier around this idea of putting people in a position to learn the constraints, the setting up the scenario for them to learn through route setting typically is so powerful and such a good understanding of what learning actually is. And I've often talked about this example when I was working with Ido Portal, who's some movement guy,
Mm-hmm.
a coach. And I've said this before on the pod. I might have even said it to you, Al, but I'm going to say it again because it was a seminal moment in my life where he was trying to teach us a skill, and he was teaching it by demonstrating it. And then he would tell us to go do it. but it was complex and it had a lot of parts. And I didn't know how to do it. And we got angry. And you'd go off with a partner. Why doesn't Ito just show us how to freaking do it? Like, I don't know how to do it. And he'd say, okay, come back, come back. And they'd demonstrate again. He's like, go figure it out. And he would mock us. He would say, figure it out, genius. You're a good mover. Go figure it out. And you know what? Eventually I did, but it was hard. And he was showing us that to be a teacher is not to marionette you through it. What does learning actually look like? And perhaps it's not something that we can just, tweak an elbow and be like, see, now you're good. Now you're world class. And that process of going through the hard stuff and understanding what it takes to learn and then setting up your environment in your life to achieve that goal that you set out is powerful. And having someone like you help us along the way, good stuff, man. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to do this. I know we talked a lot, but I told you before, I was like, this is almost therapeutic for me, but you ask a lot of really good questions, and I think we could probably talk for a long, long time.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I think if I could say to most people that this climbing is just such a good, it's something that people care about a lot, obviously, and I think when people care about something, it matters, and because oftentimes we'll almost be like, oh, well, it's just climbing. I'm just climbing rocks. But it's like, yeah, but you care about it a lot. And I think that that's important. But it also serves as a really good representation of how you approach problem solving, you know? And for me, if I have a lot of athletes that don't even necessarily, that's not their priority anymore, climbing. But if they were like, oh, I really want to learn how to do this, I will hope that all the things that we have worked through in order to try to figure it out is more about I'm trying to figure this out alongside with you instead of I'm telling you what you should be doing. And I think if you approach it from that kind of really curious, oh, hey, I have this thing and I'm setting out to try to figure it out, to me, that's like incredibly valuable, and it'll apply to a lot of other things in life. So
Yeah, and that's what we did in this podcast. It was I told you before, if everything was figured out perfectly, maybe you should just write an article. But we go down different branches that are interesting and hash it out and try to understand the nuance. And I love getting to hear your opinions on things. And one of the ways we started out was like, what have you changed your mind on? And just that willingness and ability to continue to progress and question assumptions, because whatever challenge you're faced with next was not the challenge you were faced with before. And that's especially true in climbing, where every move, every hold, always different, even every day with different freaking humidity and your skin condition. It's amazing how variable climbing is. And I think it's why it's a subject that's fun to explore mastery in. So thanks, Al. Thanks for spending the time with me. And yeah, I would
thank
love to
you.
do it again. Sometime. I have other questions, but let's let's call it. Let's say
Okay,
that
sounds
was
good.
good. All right, man. Congrats again, and thanks for spending time with me.
Yeah, thank you, Josh.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like even more content, go to patreon.com/testpiece. And while you're at it, share this podcast with someone you know who would love it. And please leave us a review or rating at wherever you get your podcasts. We've also got tons of great content on YouTube and Instagram, so don't forget to like and subscribe there. Okay, see you next week.